He's written for the New York Times, the Daily News, GQ, Smithsonian, Sports Illustrated, many other publications. He's also appeared on CNN, NPR, and Fox.
You don't know my voting there.
Okay. He lives in New York City. Cook's latest book, Kitty Genovese, The Murder of the Bystanders and the Crime That Changed America, has been nominated for the Edgar Award, and it disproves the long-accepted notion that Kitty Genovese was murdered in 1964 in full view of her neighbors. In fact, the case is much more complex and compelling than that, and so is the victim. I was off a couple of weeks ago, and he was nice enough to send me a copy of his book. I finished it in one day. It is fascinating, and I know you're going to talk a bit about it tonight, and maybe read a little bit, but Edgar Nominee, Kevin.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. I feel like potentially the boring one since this is nonfiction, but part of it is an attempt to correct something that was more fictional than we would like our newspaper stories to be. And it's interesting to be here and see when we speak that Poe gets the DTs. So that may be appropriate. A few of you may know the name of Kitty Genovese. She is famous as a murder victim. She was killed on Friday the 13th of March, 1964. She was not famous immediately after that. She was a very short story in the newspapers the next day, Queens Woman Stabbed, one of 600 plus murders in the city that year. Oddly enough, she became world famous 2 weeks later when her picture appeared on the front page of the New York Times. This haunting picture of her. And the reason that she became famous, became iconic, came to represent a certain urban terror, what was going wrong with America, and to represent what was called urban apathy, was because this murder story wasn't about the victim, really, and it wasn't even about the killer. It was about the witnesses. And that's because the beginning of the story that appeared in the Times in late March, 2 weeks after the crime, splashed across the front page, began, for more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. Twice the sound of their voices and the sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out, and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead. This story so terrified America and also seemed to fit a very nervous time in America. This was months after the Kennedy assassination, the height of the Cold War, a time when people wondered whether the big ugly city, the big cold city, was turning us into the kind of people who didn't know who our neighbors were and wouldn't lift a finger to help them. These 38, precisely 38 in the newspaper story, people watching this poor young woman die seemed to explain that this was the biggest fact of urban life. And it led to apathy beats in newspapers across the country. It led to movies and a terrible television movie. It led to bystander studies in college, to an account that's still taught in college in Psychology 101. And it also led to the 911 system, by the way. The outcry after Kitty Genovese was allowed to die led to the emergency telephone system that has saved many lives. At the same time, that story isn't true. It didn't happen that way. And I thought it was a fascinatingly fishy sounding story from the start. The 38 people, did they really look out their windows in Kew Gardens that night and watch this young woman be killed? If you go out to Kew Gardens, if you take the Long Island Railroad, you go past the crime scene at the Kew Gardens stop. That is where Kitty died, but it's not where she was stabbed. Go out there and walk around, and if you see the crime scene, it doesn't match the account that has been told about Kitty Genovese that has made her iconic for 50 years. That was one start, and then 2 years later, through 2 years of research, I managed to find out what I believe is a fascinating story of who Kitty Genovese was and what really happened on the night of March 13th, 1964. She's an interesting person, I believe, whose life and not just her death need to be told. So without going into the whole book, there's a fairly brief reading. This is the beginning of the book. This is my attempt to evoke what it was like to be one of those people who lived in Kew Gardens on the night that Kitty screamed at a little bit after 3 a.m. You heard her cry out. Not the words, maybe, though the words were loud. "Oh God, he stabbed me. Help me." But you'd been asleep. Your windows were shut against the cold. It's 3 in the morning, for God's sake. The sheer shrill sound, though, you couldn't miss that. Her shouts were loud enough to wake people on both sides of the street. So maybe you get up too. Maybe you pad to the window in the dark to see why somebody on Austin Street is screaming bloody murder. Do you call the police? About a girl shouting? They'd laugh. 20 to 1, it's nothing. A lover's spat. A wife or girlfriend getting smacked, which is a lousy thing but not exactly news. Not on Kew Gardens' worst block, a couple of hours after last call at Bailey's Pub. Except that this isn't regular pissed-off drunk hollering. This is panic. Help me! On the sidewalk outside the Austin bookshop, a man bent over a girl. See him? She's on her knees doing what? Trying to get up. It's hard to tell, looking through a smudged window in the bare branches of the pin oaks and sycamores lining the street. Somebody yells, "Leave that girl alone!" More lights pop on up and down the block. The girl and her attacker, if that's what he is, are alone on the sidewalk under a street lamp, visible to dozens of bleary-eyed people in the 9th-floor Mowbray apartments on one side of Austin Street and the 2-story faux Tudor apartment building on the other. Somebody must have called the cops by now. And look, the guy's leaving, slipping into the dark, leaving the girl behind. She gets up, not screaming anymore. She gets up and walks past the shuttered TV radio store with its Starburst sign in the window. Hit records, 45 RPM, 39 cents. Stepping slowly, but not like a drunk, more like sleepwalking. One wobbly step after another, like she's in a dream. She walks to the corner of the Tudor building, goes under the drugstore sign, and then around the corner, out of sight. It's quiet. A minute goes by. Windows going dark on both sides of the street. There's no sign anything happened, just a few dark spots on the sidewalk that might have been there before. 5 more minutes pass. All over, nothing more to see. Until he comes back. The same man, with a hat on now, a fedora with a feather in the brim. He strolls past the railroad station to the Tudor building, looking in doorways like he left something behind. Trailing the girl around the corner, carrying something in his hand. Looking for her? It's so hard to see. Your phone's right there.